So I'm going to talk with you about what these technologies mean for organizations, and I must say I'm a kind of pragmatic guy. I was getting a little bit uncomfortable this morning with these really long-term predictions about what's going to happen to us in the future. I'm going to be much more in the present this afternoon and talk about what cognitive technologies are doing to the workforce as we speak, which, as you might guess, is not quite as dramatic as what might happen in the future. I do think we need the digital workforce. I don't think there's much doubt about that for a whole variety of reasons. Some kind of supply reasons. We have a lot of powerful technology now. Like Amelia, we have a lot of data on which we can kind of train that technology to make great decisions, but I think the demand factors are even stronger. As some people have suggested today, we do a lot of tedious work, and why should we keep doing that? We're expensive as labor goes, and we need vacations and sick days and so on. So somewhat problematic as a labor source. In general, I think in many of the situations in which cognitive technology is being applied, it's not replacing humans. There's just too much data for humans to have ever done that. If any of you have worked, for example, in the digital advertising space at all, you may know that that ad that you see on the New York Times site or whatever as you're reading about the Trump decision was put there just for you, and it was put there after an examination of all of your cookie data and so on. It was put there after an auction to see was that the best site, and at what price would the Times charge for posting that ad on their site. And all of that decision making needs to be done in about 15 milliseconds. And my guess is none of us here are capable of doing that with our own brains. The other sort of sad fact is that we are not very good decision makers, we humans. We always thought we were. Economists told us we were. They said we were rational. It turns out we're not. There's a whole school now of economics, which was interestingly created by a couple of social psychologists who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, suggesting that we make all sorts of really biased and bad decisions much of the time. And so if you want a good, reliable decision, you might want to get a machine to do that for you. So these are some of the reasons why I think it's somewhat inevitable that we will have a more digital workforce. There are, of course, some concerns about it. Various people worried about the singularity, or the other word for superintelligence, which we heard about this morning. Smart people like Bill Gates, and then you have the sort of robot overlord school, Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking and so on, saying the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. I'm not going to talk about that so much. By the way, one other bit of good news is Elon Musk at least said he would stop hanging around with Donald Trump if he pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. So I'm not sure that will change a huge amount. But Bob Shiller, the economist I respect the most, and somebody who's done a lot of work actually in behavioral economics, said, our jobs matter a lot to us, not just for economics, but for meaning. And losing them is a source of real concern. I would put climate change as a more important problem than this, but I'd put this in the top 5, maybe anyway. And then some people talk about sort of riots in the streets. Hordes of citizens of zero economic value. You can just see them, running down Broadway. So I'm not really going to talk about all of those things. I think for every negative aspect of this stuff, there is also a positive one. I'm kind of in the middle on it. We can solve a lot of very difficult problems. I've had a number of people tell me that IBM Watson has already cured cancer. That is not in fact true, but I do think that we with AI tools are moving in that in that direction. There is a potential for huge productivity gains, and as Michael Chewy mentioned last night, we need them. Our productivity has not been doing terribly well around the world for the last several years. Lots of social issues that we need to solve. You heard about the elderly in Japan, but we have a number of them as well. Urban congestion with driverless cars could be solved. Shortages of nurses, university education. You're going to hear a little bit about that in a little while from Penn State. And of course, Amelia's forte, better, more accurate, more knowledge-based advice for your customers or employees. And that's very important as well. Now, I think as Chaitin said this morning, past approaches to automation customer interaction, I think he said IVR was a failure. Facebook trending topics was one of the great developments in fake news. I think the #1 fake news item was that Obama had banned the Pledge of Allegiance from American schools at one point. They decided that maybe automation didn't work all that well in Facebook trending topics. Automation is often a race to the bottom in that it may lower your costs, but it lowers your competitors' costs and ultimately lowers everybody's margins, limits your ability to innovate. Once you've kind of automated things, it makes it harder to reinvent them. So probably not a great strategy for many, many companies and industries. As a result, perhaps, these technologies tend to move fairly slowly to change the jobs picture. Now you can imagine, I think this building, this hotel might have been here then, but I'm not entirely sure. Somewhere in the Wall Street area, there was a meeting probably 35 years ago about this new set of technologies. I don't think they called it fintech then, but we could have, that were going to revolutionize retail banking. And that was about the time, early 1980s, that ATMs became popular, and online banking was kind of a little bit of a twinkle in the eye, but could be seen down the road a bit. And you can imagine what people at that gathering were saying about the threat to bank tellers, for example. At the time, in the early 1980s, we had about 500,000 bank tellers in the United States. How many do you think we have now? Anybody vote for 250,000? Anybody, how many vote for more than 250,000? How many for less than 250,000? We've got 500,000 bank tellers in the United States in 2017. The number has barely budged. Now, it's not a great thing to be a bank teller. You don't want to advise your children to go into that career because we have about half as many people in the United States as we had in 1980, and the same number of bank tellers, so per capita it's declining, but these things take a long time. People find other things to do. Wells Fargo found some other things for its bank tellers to do. I think we have to be careful about these predictions on job loss from these technologies. So there are a variety of jobs that are already automated by these technologies, at least key tasks within them. Everybody from call center representatives, which you could, I think, in some organizations put in the service category, in some organizations in the knowledge work category. Secretaries, some of you probably know about Amy Ingram from X.AI, landscaping, hamburger chef. We were all going to become burger flippers, but actually there are machines now that can do a good job of flipping burgers. All sorts of drivers of various types. I've done some work with John Deere. They are now bundling with every sale of a big piece of farm equipment a dog. I heard about this and said, what's the dog for? entertain the farmer when there's nothing much to do in the cab? And they said, no, it's to bite the farmer if they touch anything. Because these are so automated, and they don't even need light anymore. They can plow the fields 24 hours a day because they work totally by GPS. Various back office financial workers with robotic process automation, hotel clerks, and even IT technicians. You know, you think, well, the fast-growing field of information technology will always have jobs. You know, at Facebook, the ratio of IT engineers to servers, 1 for every 35,000 servers. So if you want to go into the fast-growing field of information technology, find a company that has a hell of a lot of servers, because otherwise there's not going to be a lot of options there. So the question then becomes, is knowledge work next to go? And I'll have an answer for that in a second, but I think we have to realize this is not a new trend. We've seen aspects of this movie before. We saw in the Industrial Revolution, people disappeared from farms and factories and had to find other jobs. They eventually did, although it wasn't always pleasant for them to have that transition. In the last century, we saw service jobs start to be automated in a substantial way, like bank tellers and like travel agencies and so on. The question now becomes, how about those knowledge work jobs? And this is a question that hits home because how many do you think of yourselves as knowledge workers? Raise your hands. Of course you're knowledge workers. What are you, ditch diggers or something? I don't think so. This was the domain to which our parents said, you know, get a good education, learn about the world so you can always have a job. Well-paying, clean, nice office job where you can retire successfully from. We always thought we could go upstream from these other jobs, but we don't really know that there is an upstream of knowledge work as we know it today. So my clear, unequivocal answer is yes and no. Knowledge work is next. I could be an economist with that level of clarity, don't you think? Tasks are at risk. There's no doubt about it. And I'll give you a list of them in a second. And it's pretty clear that I think there will be some job loss from these technologies. We might need, you know, there's a lot of these technologies being used in commercial litigation. So we might need 9 lawyers instead of 10. Some wouldn't view that as a huge tragedy, that we wouldn't have quite as many lawyers. But for the lawyers, I'm sure it would be tragic. The good news is that there are going to be a lot of jobs, and nobody can tell you how many, working alongside these machines. And I will tell you something about that in a second. The other good news is that I think we will, if we do this well, have plenty of productivity gains, and so we could pay people for not working and so on, or we could redeploy them on a massive scale. Whether we will or not, we don't have a terribly good track record, at least in the US for that. In general, though, I think there is definitely no room for complacency, and if you're an individual worker, or if you're the parent or grandparent of individual people in the labor force, this is not a time to be complacent. This is a time to be thinking about, well, what can I do if aspects of my job get taken over by these machines? So just in case you aspire to be a knowledge worker or are one, of course the most important job there, teacher/professor, there are machines that can do certain aspects of that job already better than I can. I mentioned lawyers, accountants. I work a fair amount with Deloitte as an advisor, and they are diligently working to automate substantial aspects of audit and tax processes. Radiologists and pathologists, these kind of back office medical professions, are definitely problematic in this regard, in that you can identify cancerous lesions by machine quite well these days. Reporting, just up The Western Highway of New York is the Associated Press. You may know that most stories now in the business and sports section are written through automated means. Architecture, translation, programming, you name it. There are lots and lots of jobs for which substantial portions can be automated. I was actually in this room couple of months ago talking to some people in financial services, and I said, there's real cause for concern that Wall Street could be the new Rust Belt. Lots and lots of Wall Street jobs that could be automated with these technologies. So the question then becomes, of course, what does all this mean for people? And there have for a long time been two options for thinking about the relationship between people and automation technologies. One is automation, where the machine takes over completely, and the other is augmentation, where smart machines and smart people work in combination, help each other out, pick up the ball when the other one drops it, and so on. So I think somebody mentioned in a question this morning for Nick Bostrom, well, how about freestyle chess? And that's a great example of augmentation. He was a little bit dismissive, saying, well, yeah, maybe in some of those areas, but in the long run, our skills won't matter at all. I went out and tried to jump off the building then, but I couldn't get to the roof. It was locked up. So, of course, then the question becomes, what's the equivalent of freestyle chess in business? How can we think about augmentation in a business context? And so a lot of my research has been around, are there valid roles for humans that involve augmentation? And the answer is yes, and these exist today. We don't have to wait for them. The core augmentation role I call stepping in. It's sort of really getting into the belly of the beast and working with these smart machines as a day-to-day collaborator. I think of a number of you are from the insurance industry. I think of insurance underwriters. I call that the oldest automated profession. We've been doing insurance underwriting automation for a long time with rule-based systems, and underwriters still exist in somewhat smaller numbers, and the good ones kind of monitor what these automated underwriting systems are doing and make changes or recommend changes to technology experts and know when they can pick up the ball from the smart machine. There's also the step-up role, which I think the greatest example of is the hedge fund manager. And they just released some of their yearly incomes a couple of weeks ago. It seemed to be a pretty valued role in America, judging by the salaries being paid to them. And basically, if you're a hedge fund manager, most of the trading is going to be done by machine, right? Stocks and bonds are almost all automated from a trading perspective, but somebody's got to decide, do we have the right level of automation, and how's the portfolio doing, and do we need to adjust it, and so on. So that's another valid role. Then there's, if you think, well, maybe why should I compete with these machines, there's the step aside role, which is to say, I'm going to do something that machines aren't very good at. I have one example in my household. One of my kids is a television comedy writer. Now, there have been attempts to do automated script writing for television. It's even worse than the worst human, if you can believe that. So I think if you choose a highly creative job, an empathetic-oriented job, working directly with other humans in roles that they value, you'll probably be fine in one of these step-aside roles. There's also this curious one of stepping narrowly, which is to choose something that is such a niche that it really wouldn't be economical to automate. I thought of this first. I was reading an article about a man in Boston who makes a living, a pretty good living, judging from the fact he drives a Rolls Royce around the streets of Boston, which is a kind of nutty thing to do from the beginning. But all he does is connect buyers and sellers of Dunkin' Donuts franchises. And you think, well, why isn't that automated? Because computers are really good at connecting buyers and sellers of things. But if you think about it, people would be unlikely to say, I'm going to build a platform for connecting buyers and sellers of Dunkin' Donuts franchises. It's just not a big enough category. And then finally, there is stepping forward, the category involving building these systems in the future. So, your kids can go to work for IPsoft or Google or IBM or whatever and create, develop, market, support these kinds of systems. So how many jobs will this create? Nobody knows, but I think there will be a substantial number. And if you can legitimately say that you prepared yourself for one of these categories, I think you'll probably do fine. So how, that's kind of individuals, how should corporations be thinking about these capabilities? Just 6 ideas. Unfortunately, I'm lacking one finger here. It's very useful, I think you probably figured out. There are a lot of technologies here. AI is a constellation of technologies. IPsoft is branching out and doing some more machine learning oriented things. It started out as primarily doing computational linguistics for natural language processing. There's still, as I think Nick Bostrom said this morning, rule-based systems can still be useful. Various forms of machine learning, deep learning, and so on. So it's pretty important to know what technologies do what. Build on your strengths with analytics. I mean, 90% of what you get in artificial intelligence has a statistical underpinning to it. So if you have some people in your organization who are good at analytics, you have an analytics group of some type or other, get them to start moving you into this space. It won't be that difficult of a transition. Think about what processes and tasks need cognitive help. Where do you have knowledge bottlenecks within the organization? For example, identify some use cases, create a portfolio of pilots, not sort of huge projects, but build toward a platform, have something bigger in mind that these will support. Engage in cognitive work redesign, I'll talk about that in a second. And at some point, you've got to move beyond the pilot stage. If we're going to get productivity out of these things, you're going to have to scale up, and you're going to have to figure out a way. If you're focused on augmentation in particular, you're not going to be cutting lots of heads. And by the way, I didn't hear of anybody in any of the talks this morning saying that they had cut any heads out. We're going to have to figure out some way to economically justify all of this if we're going to get some productivity value. So cognitive work design, I think, is kind of an extension of what Paul Doherty mentioned earlier today, business process reengineering. I'm an old guy. I wrote the first article and the first book on that topic. Unfortunately, not the most popular article or book on the topic, but the first anyway. And I do think that anytime a powerful new technology like this comes along, there's an opportunity to take some aspects of those ideas and think about, how do we redesign work or reimagine work as it was described earlier? Where do the machines stop and the humans start? In some cases, like in surgical robots, it will be 80% human, 20% machine. In others, like insurance underwriting or credit approval or whatever, it's going to be 80% machine, 20% human. What are the valid augmentation roles for humans? How do we get the people who currently do the work to play in this process? Because I think obviously they'll be much more engaged in how to think creatively about how the technologies fit their jobs if they're involved. The mantra in re-engineering, and I think it was a good one, says think about broad cross-functional processes that benefit customers. The problem, though, with cognitive technologies is they only work on tasks right now. So we have to kind of think about how do those tasks fit into a broader context. Some lessons from the pioneers. I have a database that I've compiled with the help of Deloitte of early cognitive projects, 160 of them. Turns out the big transformation moonshots don't work very well in many cases. There's some great examples. You may have heard of MD Anderson, this cancer center in Houston, was going to use an AI system, I won't say what vendor, but you probably all know anyway, to treat cancer. $52 million later, not a single patient treated. The project's on hold. But interestingly enough, at that same institution, the CIO was doing a bunch of low-hanging fruit projects around things like a cognitive concierge, or, where families should stay when they have a family member in the hospital, or even identifying which patients are least likely to pay their bills, so we can start massaging them early on in the process and maybe get them to pay up. So that low-hanging fruit, I think, is the way to go with this stuff. We're not quite ready, and I think we've heard this from a lot of people today. We're not quite ready for the moonshots. Out of those 160 projects that I've looked at, there are a grand total of 20 jobs scheduled, not yet done, for elimination. So I don't think we should be complacent. I don't think that job loss is going away as an issue, but it's a longer-term issue, not a short-term issue. There are some organizations that are starting to say there's broad applicability of this stuff, and they're creating cognitive centers of excellence, which I do think is a good idea. Agile methods, you've heard that today, work very well. Quick deliverables, lots of engagement with stakeholders, and so on. Change management required with every new cognitive task. This is scary stuff for a lot of people in organizations. And I think ultimately we will see a revolution in business from these technologies, but it's going to happen in a very evolutionary fashion with a series of small successes. So if you're an organization thinking about, how should I be viewing this stuff, avoid this automation-driven race to the bottom. Augmentation is both more likely and, I think, a better idea. These technologies should enable not just cost reduction, but higher quality offerings, flexible processes, more satisfied customers, which you've heard about a lot today. You should think about what's your distinctive capability. You're not just wanting to deflect callers from talking to humans. You want to think about how does technology of this type advance the thing that's most important to your success. You're going to need some experts, and if you're not hiring any people at the entry level anymore, which is, by the way, where the problem happens in most organizations these days, you may wonder where the experts of the future are going to come from. That is an important thing to think about now. And finally, I think you should put somebody in charge of this stuff, particularly if you're taking a broader focus on cognitive technology than just the intelligent agent kind of thing that you're doing with IPsoft. IPsoft said this morning that they want to be a platform for your broader AI efforts, so that to me suggests you need an organizational platform and somebody overseeing it to make that work.